do every fortnight called From Talk to Action. But today's talk is called Inclusion Under Scrutiny and How to Defend Your Data, your strategy with data. My mission for running these webinars is that I really want us to create the best place on earth to learn how to embed inclusivity into how your business grows and develops. So ED&I, or equity, diversity, and inclusion, is under a lot of scrutiny and a lot of pressure at the moment. I don't know if any of this is you can relate to in terms of your organization, but there's a lot of economic and political pressure at the moment. So there's we're seeing a real rise in sort of far right politics, for example, which is creating division rather than unifying society. And over the last couple of years, we've seen some really kind of unpleasant events roll out. So we've seen, riots in the UK, for example, and we see things coming out of the Trump administration and the White House, which is all designed to really kind of try to create division rather than unify us. But at the same time, lots of organizations are working under lots of economic pressure at the moment. So they're having to cut budgets. Sales are not as good as they were hoping it would be. We're seeing an increase in costs. So, for example, in the UK, a rise in national insurance has squeezed a lot of businesses, particularly those that are working in like the hospitality sector, which is really squeezing the kind of the profitability of an organization. And I think all of this is creating a bit of a kind of storm where senior leaders are asking themselves, why are we doing this? Like in terms of ED&I, why are we really investing a lot of time and effort in ED&I? And what are we getting for our money? What are we getting for the time and effort and the budget that we're putting into this? And your role as somebody working in HR, I don't think is to sell inclusivity to the organization, because hopefully you're working in an organization that already gets it, certainly on a kind of logical level. They understand the reason why EDI is important for the business. But it's all about how do we actually prove that this is actually good for business, that it is worth our time and effort. So in a lot of senior leadership teams that I work with, it's not about convincing the senior leadership team that it's the right thing to do, or that it's best practice, or that it's good for business. It's about demonstrating that you are delivering value to the organization. Now, one exercise that I encourage all of my clients to do, and this is some homework for you, is to conduct a PESTLE analysis. And if you've done a business degree, this might ring a few bells for you, but a PESTLE analysis stands for the political, economic, social, technological, legal or regulatory, and environmental factors that are influencing your business right now. And a lot of senior leaders, they will regularly do a PESTLE analysis. They will regularly be thinking about, okay, how is the political landscape or geopolitics affecting our business right now? How is a change in technology, the rise of AI, for example, and the increased use of machine learning in our industry impacting our business right now? What is happening economically in terms of the policies that are coming out of the Bank of England, or interest rates, or the rise of the cost of living? How are all these things affecting our business and the decisions that we're making? Very rarely, though, senior leaders think about a PESTLE analysis with an inclusivity lens. So it's actually a bit of a quick win for you to do this with your senior leadership team, to run a PESTLE analysis, but think about it from an inclusivity perspective, and to think about how those forces are really impacting your business. Now, often I see businesses putting together their business case for ED&I, and they can do it in either a kind of a strong case or a weak case. And I just want to share with you the difference between the two, what I normally see, so that hopefully you can start doing more of the things in the green hand column that on the right hand side, and avoid doing things on the left hand side on the red hand column. So what very often what I see when organizations say, well, we've got an EDI strategy, is really what they've got is a list of disconnected activities with no strategic thread running through them. So they've just got a very long, overwhelming shopping list. Whereas organizations that do it well, where they have a strong case, they've got a small number of very clear, very well scoped out, aligned strategic priorities with their business goals. So it's aligned to the business as well. So the business might be thinking, well, next year we're going to grow our business through an acquisition, or we're going to launch a new product, or we're going to launch into a new market. What we've got is we've got an EDI strategy that helps actually underpin that broader business strategy, rather than the disconnected list of tactical tactical activities that operate as a bit like a shopping list. Next, in the terms of a weak case, is that we've got the EDI is owned and it's delivered mostly by HR, that it's seen as the HR department's responsibility. And yes, in reality, a lot of ED&I is about people and culture. And so most of the work is driven out of HR. But actually, on the green hand side, what we see this successful businesses doing is that they've got real accountability that's shared across the senior leadership team, and they've got buy-in from each of the business units. So your chief marketing officer is thinking about, okay, how inclusive are my marketing campaigns? Are we targeting underserved audiences right now? Your facilities people are thinking about, okay, how inclusive are our buildings? Have we designed our workspaces and our workplaces to be accessible and inclusive? Your chief technology officer is thinking about, well, how accessible are our IT systems, both our internal facing systems that employees are using, but also the external digital platforms that our customers or clients are using to do business with us. So ED&I is not just seen as a HR department's responsibility, it's shared across the whole organization. The third weakness that I normally see is that there's no consequences if actions are not done. So we often see, and this is a sign of kind of poor performing teams, where we have a lack of accountability. And a framework that I like to use a lot is Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. And what he talks about at the top of the pyramid is successful high-performing teams have a real focus on results, and they hold each other accountable for achieving those results. And we need to see the same for ED&I as well, that when the pressure is put on the business, when we've got lots of forces, internal or external, on us, that we don't say, well, you know, this ED&I work that we're doing, it can be deprioritized. We can just take off the accelerator. That actually we've got some real focus on and governance in place in terms of what we're tracking, and we're reviewing that, and we're holding each other accountable for achieving results. The fourth kind of weakness that I often see is that there's no clear or realistic budget set for the work. Any work that we do around EDI is going to have a lot of it is going to have a cost attached to it. That could be an external cost. You might be working with a training provider if you're delivering training, or it could be an internal cost in terms of allocating time for people to actually do the work. But we're just not very realistic in terms of the time that it's actually going to take to implement our ED&I strategy. or the budget required. And so what success looks like is that we've got a strategy with a lot of activities that have been fully costed out, fully funded, and they've all got commercial justification. Behind every activity that you do, there's a business case to say, we're doing this for these particular reasons, and this is the return on investment or the return on effort that we expect by doing this package of work. I suppose linked to no consequences is also the lack of having key performance indicators. So often what I see is organizations do have a list of KPIs, but again, they're very long laundry list of key performance indicators, and they're not very specific. They're quite hard to measure. It's much better to have one or three really important metrics that matter the most, and really focus on one or three key metrics. So you might want to be tracking the diversity of candidates that are making it through different stages of your recruitment process if you do a lot of recruitment, and attracting and recruiting diverse talent into your business as a way of being able to be more representative. For example, you might want to track some form of employee engagement score about how people feel like they belong in the organization. And I've got a really key metric for you that I love to use with my clients that I'll share with you shortly. Another weakness that I often see is that often businesses are focused only on cost, and they're not articulating that into value or return on investment. So they look at a diversity and inclusion initiative and they say, oh my God, that costs a lot of money. You know, that's going to cost me £25,000. But they don't think of it from a normal business investment portfolio perspective. They're not thinking, well, actually, if I invest £25,000 in this, the return on my business is going to be £150,000, for example. So that represents a good return on investment. They often see that diversity and inclusion is just a cost center rather than something that's generating value for the business. And then finally, what I often see a lot is senior leadership teams just kind of talking about very generic statistics. So they've read the McKinsey reports, for example, or other big four accountancy firms have produced some really good reports, but they talk very generically about these statistics. And when you talk about generic statistics, a lot of senior leaders, they kind of switch off because they think to themselves, yeah, that's interesting. I get it on an intellectual level, but how does that actually translate to my business? You know, I'm not a big four accountancy firm. So how does that relate to my business as a chemicals manufacturer or a zoo? I'm currently working with the zoo, which is a really fun client to work with. But you know, how do we actually make data relevant to your organization? So use the red and the green list as a bit of a checklist of where you think your business is focused, and try to shift more into the green column and away from the red column. Now, talking of statistics, when I worked at Deloitte, I worked for a partner called Emma Codd. She's now the sort of globally in charge of equity, diversity, and inclusion for Deloitte. And in my podcast interview, she said that before she said that she had calculated that it was costing Deloitte £68 million a year for women leaving the business because work-life balance or cultural reasons. And she would use this number ruthlessly with her fellow partners to say, look, I've got £68 million on the table. Shall I just chuck it out the window? And this was such a key figure that she used to try and make sure that she got buy-in from the rest of the partners in the firm to invest in invest time, money, and energy in running ED&I initiatives at Deloitte. And this for me is such a startling figure, because this is actually just focusing at the time on UK and Ireland. And she was only looking at the time of women leaving the business. She wasn't even calculating other people who have other protected characteristics thinking of leaving the business either. So it's such a huge figure. Now, the question that I think we need to ask ourselves is, are we measuring the right data? And I like to think in data in terms of leading or lagging data. Lagging data is often what we measure. It's often things like the demographics or the representation of our workforce. So how many disabled people do we employ? How many women do we employ? How many people from an ethnic minority background do we employ? These are all useful statistics to show the representation of our business compared to the communities that we serve, or the customers that we serve, or the talent pools that we're recruiting from. But it's lagging data. It's data that will only catch up over time after we've done the hard work. What I think we really need to be focusing on is our leading data. And our leading data, it gives us much more of a real-time sense of what's going on in the business. And the kind of leading data that we want to be tracking are a sense of belonging that people have in the organization, for instance, whether people feel like whether they feel like it's safe to be able to speak up without fear of backlash. In other words, do we have that right level of psychological safety in the team in order to build that kind of real strong foundation of trust that we have to have in high-performing teams? Now, with this pyramid, very often businesses are so focused on the top of the pyramid, what they want is greater diversity, without realizing that actually greater diversity is the end result of doing all of the hard work. Here in the UK, we live in a very diverse nation. Diversity exists in our country. Diversity is already there in our talent pools. Inclusion is a choice, and it's about removing the barriers that are preventing that diverse talent that already exists from being able to enter our businesses or being able to progress and thrive within our organizations. So where we need to be focusing actually is on the bottom of this pyramid. We need to be making sure that we're providing equity. And what I mean by that is, are we removing the barriers that people face that is preventing them from doing their best work? Now, I like to kind of borrow this from the social model of disability, because I've got a disability that I was born with. And what we say in disability world, between the medical and the medical model and the social model, is we say in the medical model, we say that there's something inherently wrong with the individual, that there needs to be some sort of intervention, there needs to be a fix. But actually what we're saying is that the social model is more relevant to us today, because it's the barriers that are created in society that prevent people from thriving. So as a wheelchair user, if I can't get into a building, it's the fact that there's a lack of a lift or ramp access that's preventing me from being able to get into that building. So the solution needs to be to try to provide a step-free option. So in terms of our workplaces, are we actually providing equity? Can people get through your recruitment process at the same speed or the same success rate as other people? Or are there certain individuals that are experiencing additional barriers in your recruitment process? If we look at your talent management process, for example, are there people that are able to get promoted as quickly through the organization as others? Or are there additional barriers for certain people in the organization? So looking at your working parents, are there additional barriers for your working parents that are preventing them from getting promoted in your company in terms of your talent and performance management processes? So once we've got this real focus on equity, that's when we're creating equality, and we can start to make sure that we're creating a culture of an inclusion and belonging. And when we do that, we become a much more attractive place to work. And it becomes much easier for us to be able to attract and recruit and retain the diverse talent that we ultimately want. Now, I did promise I would share with you this kind of favorite question or golden question that I like to ask in a lot of surveys that we often, when we do surveys for clients with their employees. And this question is, are you thinking about leaving the organization in the next 6 months because you don't feel respected or that you belong? This is such a powerful question. And then we enable people to say, yes, I'm thinking of leaving because I don't feel respected or that I belong here. Yes, I'm thinking of leaving, but it's for other reasons. No, I'm not thinking of leaving, or I prefer not to say. And then what we do is we correlate those answers with things like salary data to be able to calculate a cost of attrition. Now, I did this survey for a technology client that employed about 900 people. And of the individuals that said, yes, I'm thinking of leaving the organization because I don't feel that I'm respected or that I belong here, we calculated that it would potentially cost this client £1.5 million over the next 6 months. So once you have a figure like that, you can then start to use that, start to build your business case and start to get the support from your chief financial officer or your chief exec to get the resources that you need. When you are talking with your senior leadership team, it's worth thinking, who am I speaking to in terms of what is my audience? What are they thinking and feeling? And what do they need to hear from me? And to try and simplify this, we talk to senior leaders that either think about diversity and inclusion from a logical or an emotional perspective. So there might be senior leaders that think, yes, there's a real strong business case here. If we have an inclusive culture, we're going to reduce our employee turnover. That's going to potentially save our business X millions of pounds if we do that. So they're thinking of things in a very kind of logical, rational manner, and they're going to want data, facts, and figures. We also have senior leaders that think maybe from more of an emotional perspective. So they're thinking, well, actually, how do I want people to feel at the end of working here when they go home to their families? What do I want them to be saying about working for this organization? I do talk to a lot of senior leaders that they're thinking about the future of their own children. So I've worked with senior leaders that have said things like, oh, my son or my daughter's just being diagnosed with dyslexia or autism. And I'm really worried about how they're going to get on in the future of work. Or my son or daughter has just come out to me as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, for example. And I'm thinking about how inclusive our workplace is for LGBT folk in the organization. So they often maybe have a personal connection. But there's this big red dot in the middle that we all have. And this is what's going on in our other than consciousness. And within here is fear. A lot of people are really worried about saying the wrong thing. They don't want to cause offense. They don't want to put their foot in it. They don't want to cause embarrassment to themselves or others. And when that happens, they tend to recoil. They don't have those brave conversations that they should be having. They tend to kind of just step back and avoid having those difficult or awkward conversations. Also within this big red dot as well, we have things like our unconscious biases that we all have as human beings. And we just need to raise awareness of how unconscious bias affects the decisions that we make. So think about your audience in terms of, are you talking to a logical or emotional audience member? And also it's culturally within your company as well. So when I worked at the BBC, it was all about ideas and creativity. But then when I went to Deloitte, it was all about numbers. And that made sense because culturally they're very different businesses. Deloitte is an accountancy firm. Of course they're going to like statistics and numbers. BBC is a creative organization. Their currency is based on ideas. and coming up with new and novel ways. So just building on that actually is another framework that I like to use with senior leaders called the Game Changing Index. And the Game Changing Index is all about what energizes you for making an impact. Now, you would do an assessment, which typically takes 10 minutes, and you get a number in each area on the screen. And the higher the number, it just means that you've got more energy for that. Now, I'm going to just describe each one. Now, obviously, I appreciate you probably haven't taken the assessment yourself, but just go with your gut instinct for now in terms of where you think you might be energized for making an impact. And then we can talk about how you can lean into that. So in the top right-hand corner, we've got the game changers who are really energized by possibilities. They really like to think outside the box. They really like to come up with new and novel ways of doing things. They're all about creating original ideas. We've then got the strategists in the top left-hand corner who like to make sense of those ideas. Strategists are really energized by thinking, well, why are we doing this in the first place? How are we actually going to roll this out across our organization? What does the roadmap look like? So your game changers are people that come up with brilliant ways of making your organization more inclusive. They'll come up with fantastic things that you just haven't thought about before. The strategists are really good at making sense of those ideas, creating some structure around it, focusing on the how and the why, and creating a bit of a roadmap for you. We then move on to the implementers who are really energized by just getting stuff done. They just want to roll up their sleeves. They work really well with the strategists. They'll say, brilliant, appreciate we've got a strategy, but now let me just crack on and get the job done. I'm going to make this happen. They're not necessarily perfectionists. They're quite happy with 80%. That's good enough for them. And then we've got the polishers. I'm a 10 out of 10 polisher. And polishers are all about making things as good as they can be. So they've got a real keen eye on quality assurance. They're always thinking to themselves, how do we go the extra mile? How do we make things better? 80% isn't good enough for me. It needs to be 100% or more. And they're really good at innovating by taking something and making it better. And then in the middle, we've got the playmakers. And the playmakers are really energized by just bringing everyone together, building consensus within teams, making sure that everybody is on mission and pulling in the right direction. So just think to yourself, if you were to use that framework for yourself, pick 2 areas. Which are the ones that you think resonate with you the most? And then when you go back to your desk later today, just think about how can I play into more of that energy? So if you are, let's say, a real implementer and you get energized by getting stuff done, how can you just kind of get your head down and get stuff done? How can you get things off your to-do list? How can you create that environment for implementing, for instance? But also, this is really good for thinking about how you can relate to your senior leadership team as well, because we find that we can roll up individual profiles into a team profile. And it might be, for example, that your senior leadership team, when we look at kind of the overall picture, they might be really energized by implementing. They might be a senior leadership team who are like, let's just crack on, let's just get all this done. And you might be energized by strategy. So you might be saying, hang on, before we crack on and get stuff done, are we doing the right things? Why are we doing these things in the first place? How are we actually going to go about doing this? What does our roadmap look like? And that's where the friction lies. You might have a senior leadership team saying, oh, just get on with it. And then you're sat there going, I will, but I'm not sure we're doing the right things, or I will get on with it once I'm convinced that we're doing the right things. And that's where we might see that kind of friction arise. So it's often good to think about, okay, so what is my senior leadership dynamic like, so that you can kind of play into those dynamics. So I've got a quick kind of scorecard or quiz for you. This is for you just to do yourself. I'm not asking anyone to share the results with you. So just grab a pen or paper. I'm going to quickly run through these questions. And if you answer yes to the question, give yourself 1 point. And if you answer no, give yourself 0 points. And then we'll just top them up at the end. So question 1 is, have you talked with your senior leaders about the big external pressures affecting EDI, things like politics, the economy, social change? Are they thinking about what those external pressures are on the business? Give yourself a 1 if you've had that conversation, or a 0 if not. When building your EDI business case, do you think you're using more of the strong examples in the green column that I showed you, or do you think you're kind of leaning to the red-hand side? So give yourself a 1 if you're leaning to the green side, or a 0 if you're on the left-hand side, the red side. Question 3 is, are you tracking both early signs of changes, like belonging and inclusion, and long-term outcomes like retention and representation? This is what I was talking about in terms of your leading and lagging data. Question 4 is your focus on creating fairness and equity, not just hiring more diverse people? In other words, are you focusing on the bottom of that pyramid in terms of trying to create that equity and equality? Question 5 is, do you measure how many people are thinking of leaving because they don't feel like they belong or respected? And are you able to break that down into different groups? Question 6 is, when you present inclusion data to your board, are you balancing facts and logic with real human stories? So you getting the balance between the logical, the rational, and the emotional? And then the final question is, are you playing to your own strengths and making sure your inclusion approach fits with how your senior leadership thinks and makes decisions? So are you leaning into what energizes you most for making an impact?